I've now lost 481 games of ranked in Marvel Rivals, and that's given me a lot of time to learn. I'll be honest, I've not come into this as the best player in the world. I didn't have much experience in hero shooters, and whilst I have had experience in other shooter games, I was definitely the kind of player into this game that needed to learn a lot. And I have to say, after losing so many games of ranked, I have learned a lot. I have also won games, don't worry, I'm not that bad. Now with me sitting around Grandmaster 2, completely solo on my own, I've been through ups, I've been through downs, I've had the worst teammates you can imagine, I've had some pretty good teammates along the way as well. And through all of this, I've learned a great deal about what it takes to be better at the game and to not keep losing as often. And this comes from the perspective of someone who's been in the dirt, who's had terrible games, who's not been necessarily the best player out there. And I think that perspective is probably going to matter for you more than, like, watching a video on how to be better from someone who's literally been playing Overwatch professionally for the last 5 years. You know what I mean? Like, I've got a bit more of a realistic approach when it comes to tackling this game from someone who doesn't have all the experience necessary. So I have listed out 5 things that, in my personal opinion, are far more important than anything else when it comes to things like ultimate economy and aiming and positioning and damage and securing kills, all that stuff. Like, it's important, but I think these 5 things, honestly, are probably more important when it comes to winning games. And I think this first one is probably the biggest, most important lesson ever. The thing is with Marvel Rivals, it's a 6v6 game. And no matter how good you are, the truth is, when you play ranked, you're going to be alongside other people who've also gotten to that rank. They've gone through the same experiences as you, and so have your enemies. Chances are they're probably somewhere in the same skill range as you. Some will be better, some will be worse, and, the ranks are pretty inflated right now, but they got there just like you did. So when it comes to putting in effort in the match, you're all kind of equally putting in the same amount of effort. And when you spread that across 6 different players, really, it becomes really important to realize that there is not too much you can do as a personal single player in that 6-team squad sometimes. And if you don't believe me, just think of those games where someone on your teammate has disconnected. No matter how good you may be or how good all 5 of you are, it suddenly becomes almost unwinnable when that happens. Because no matter how good you are at the game, you cannot carry teams if there's too many players on your team that just are failing to do anything, right? So how do we solve this problem where there's only a certain amount you can do as a player, and it almost feels like sometimes you just get put up with players on your team that just don't seem to know what they're doing? But then again, they also got to the rank that you're in as well. So how did they do it? Well, the number one answer usually is they're just having a bad game, or they're having a bad day. They're not performing well. Whatever you see when you spectate them is probably just the worst that they've ever been, and you're noticing it now because they are the person with the most deaths. They're the one making the most mistakes, and it makes you feel like, how is this terrible player somehow got into my rank and now on my team? And it feels a little bit frustrating, right? They're just having a bad game. And that's when you realize that that player who's doing terribly on your team could actually be doing just as good as you, or even better, and they could even be carrying the game. And the only way to make that happen is to try and get their morale up. They've probably gone on an 8-loss streak or something ridiculous like that, and they are completely burnt out. So what do you do to fix that? Well, firstly, you try to take them off of roles that they are struggling on. If they're like a diver and they just keep dying, then that's the first issue, right? Or maybe they're a support, but they're not really using their ult in the right way, and they would rather play DPS. There may be some way to fix that, right? There may be some way to fix what that player is doing, whether it's switching role or switching hero. And the faster you notice how badly someone on your team is, identify that issue and reason with them to make a switch, the faster you can fix the game. That is a very, very difficult thing to do when most players look at everyone else on the team and also go, all my teammates are terrible. I don't think they're going to do very well. I'm the one carrying this game. A lot of people have that sort of main character syndrome. So when it comes to trying to convince somebody else to swap off, it's a very, very difficult thing to do. And that's why this game very much comes down to just learning how to manage other people and convince them in the most polite way you can if they'd like to switch. And I found quite an interesting way to do this. If I'm noticing a player is doing pretty badly, I'll go to Rivals Meta, and on that website, you can type in their name and see their win rates in their recent matches and see which hero they're actually the best with. And then you can suggest to them, hey, why don't you play this hero? Why don't you play this? Whatever they may be better at, and swap with them. Just be like, hey, why don't you play this instead? It might be a bit more beneficial for the team. And immediately, they're going to not really notice, like, you saying, oh, switch off, you're doing bad, right? That's the main response people get. When you ask someone to switch to another hero, the main sort of feedback you get is, oh, that guy is mad at me, I'm going to fight back and just be arguing with that guy. That's usually what happens. You see someone on your team doing badly, you ask them to switch, and they kind of take it negatively, as if you're having a go at them for playing underperforming. But really, you just want to help the team and switch things up. But if you find out what hero they're good at and say, hey, do you think you'd like to switch with me and play this hero instead? Then maybe that will work. It's worked for me quite a few times. I've literally gone on the website and seen, I've had like a player playing Spider-Man, and I've noticed he's not doing very well. I go on there and see that he's got like a 55% win rate with Winter Soldier, and I'm like, okay, hey, do you want to play Winter Soldier? Maybe I can play Rocket for you, right? And then suddenly, bam, it's working, right? And that can solve the problem. Now, this goes two ways. Sometimes your team's doing fine, but someone on the enemy team is doing far, far too good. Now, in that case, you cannot really support that player to do better because they're already doing really well and they're on the enemy team. What do? You ruin their day. You do everything you can to kill that player. It doesn't even matter what happens. You need to shut down that player, and then things will change. I actually had a game where I had a Spider-Man that was completely destroying my team, and it was really, really funny because I was kind of like getting the feeling that my whole team was falling apart because of this one Spider-Man. He was completely destroying us, to be honest. He was very, very good. But I just thought, you know what? I'm going to change to, I think it was Punisher. And I'm just going to start focusing him. Every time he came to swing in, I would just look for him. I'd be waiting. I would just forget about the rest of the players whenever I heard him swinging in. And I would focus him as hard as I could. And then every time he died, I would type in all chat, I hate spiders. I would just say that. Like, I was joking that I had arachnophobia and I really hate spiders. And then eventually they swapped off to Hela. I killed them like 4 or 5 times, and they swapped off to Hela, and the whole enemy team fell to pieces. It was really, really funny. So that's a really good example of a situation where you can change the outcome just by focusing the guy who's doing really well on the enemy team, because as soon as they're not doing so well, suddenly their whole team comp falls apart. And at the end of the game, I just kind of said, I was just joking around, and they said GG, and it was all good. It was all good. It was a funny moment, but I cracked their mental for just enough time to win the game. So that was pretty cool. So there's 2 examples of how Marvel Rivals is a people problem, solving the people having a bad day on your team and kind of making the enemies have a bad day, at least a bad game, in a nice way, with your gameplay, not with words. Don't yell at them, but with gameplay. Second thing, counter picks are the most important thing in the game. The moment I start a game, I'm thinking about who I like to play, but really I'm waiting to see who the enemies are playing, and then I'll switch. I'll usually switch fairly early on if I'm seeing somebody on the enemy team has a hero that's just not going to work against me. Like, for example, I'm playing Iron Man and they have a Hela or a Punisher. I'll probably end up switching off. If they have like a Groot and I'm playing a Hela, then I'll usually switch to Punisher, because Punishers can take down Groot Wars really easily. It's just like realizing what heroes are the best alternative to fighting the enemy team. And you won't know what the enemies are playing until you've seen them the first time. So usually you'll need to go in, and you will die. You'll probably die unless you're extremely good at it. If you don't die in a game, then you probably don't need to be watching this video. Let's be honest. If you are dying, then that's a time to change your hero, but depending on whatever the enemies are playing. So counter picks are like the most important thing, and the sooner you change your hero to better deal with the enemies, the better. Like, I know there's like tier lists of what characters are best, but really every map and match is different, and the enemies that you're fighting, the specific heroes you're going up against, is going to determine what characters are going to be better for you in that situation. Next thing is, some games are just genuinely unwinnable, and like, I don't mean just like sometimes it's unbalanced games, but sometimes your teammates just like fight each other. They literally just go at each other in the side chat, or they literally yell at each other down the mics. The amount of times I've had games where my teammates are literally like yelling so loud at each other down the mic, saying all sorts of horrible things to each other. It's kind of stressful because you're losing your points, right? You are losing your rank points because these two dudes are squabbling at each other, and it's just like, what are they doing? Why? But at the end of the day, those games are unwinnable. You could try and sort of mediate it, and sometimes it works. You know, it's better just to be like, hey guys, can you just stop? Let's focus. We can still win this. That sometimes does work, but there are a lot of times where it doesn't. There's nothing you can do. That's a loss. It's fine. The teammates are just weirding out. And that leads me to my next point, which is avoid the bad players. Now, remember how I said at the start of the video that players aren't really usually that bad. They're just probably having a bad day or a bad game. Well, in that very moment in time, if they were bad on your team, they probably will be bad for the next few games. They're probably just having a bad day, like I said. So if you avoid them, yes, you only get 3 avoids, but that's fine. That's perfect. You want to avoid them because when you queue up for your next match, as you rank up, the player base is going to get smaller and smaller. So the chance of them being in your team again is the highest it could ever possibly be when you match up after just being on their team, because they're definitely going to be in the queue in matchmaking at the same time as you. That may never happen again in your life, but in that very moment in time, they're the same rank as you, they're matching at the same time as you. It's the highest possible % chance that they could be in your next game. And if they're really that bad or performing that badly at that moment in time, you avoid them, the most likely thing that's going to happen is that player will be on the enemy team, which is a win-win for you. They're not on your team anymore, and they're on the enemy team. Perfect. You know their weaknesses, you know what hero they play, you know exactly what their problems are because you literally just spectated them doing it, and you're going to have an easy game. The amount of games I've won, like I've had games where I've lost 3 games in a row with the same teammate on my team, and I'm noticing that they're just kind of not performing too well. I avoid them. The very next game, they're on the enemy team, and we completely win. Like, it's that obvious sometimes. So I often will avoid players if I feel like they're just not really awake. They're not really performing very well. They're going in and just dying a lot without really noticing. They're not really focusing on when they use their abilities. That happens a lot because these players are just mentally fatigued. They could be good. If that was their first game of the day, I would happily have them on my team. But at that point in their gaming journey for that day, they're playing so badly, and avoid is the best way for you to just not have to play with them. And in the future, your avoids will refresh because you're going to be avoiding other people instead, and you may end up meeting them again, and suddenly they're going to be really good because they're having a better day. We're humans at the end of the day. We're not like robots. We don't play the same way every single game. Okay? And this final tip is something that I think I need to do. I haven't done it yet, but if there's a player that seems good and they're friendly, you should just add them. You know, one of the biggest problems in this game is it's a 6v6. And if you go alone, the odds aren't going to be in your favor. You may have some duos on the enemy team, right? If you add 1 or 2 people and have them in your team, you're going to have a better time. So something to consider as well. So hopefully these sort of mistakes that you can avoid, or the biggest lessons you can learn from my own learnings, will help you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the comments. Cheerio.